The neighborhood looked perfect. Rows of manicured lawns, pastel houses, and quiet streets where even the cicadas seemed subdued. But beneath its surface lay simmering tensions, invisible to some but glaringly obvious to others. Trevor Noah had moved here seeking peace, a break from the chaos of his public life. He craved calm, yet he couldn't ignore the subtle scrutiny from neighbors. Their glances lingered too long, their smiles felt distant, and every nod carried an unspoken judgment. Trevor tried not to let it bother him. He reminded himself why he'd chosen this place. The chirping birds, the fresh-cut grass, the sunlight warming his skin. Yet, the weight of being watched was exhausting. He'd spent years navigating spaces where people doubted his right to exist simply because of his skin color. Moving here hadn't erased that reality. It had just reshaped it into quieter, subtler forms. Karen Thompson lived 3 doors down. She prided herself on keeping her community safe, though what she really meant was predictable. To Karen, safety meant knowing who belonged. Trevor didn't fit her narrow definition. His car stood out among sedans, his music drifted faintly through windows, and his headphones on the porch habit made her uneasy. Each detail added up until it became something sinister in her mind. Sinister! On this afternoon, Trevor sat engrossed in a book, sunlight warming his shoulders. Across the street, Karen watched him through her kitchen window. Why was he sitting there? What was he listening to? Didn't he know how people might react? Her thoughts spiraled until she convinced herself. Something wasn't right. Trembling, she dialed 911. "Hi, yes, I need to report. Well, I'm not sure exactly, but there's a man sitting on his porch. He seems—" Officer Daniels heard the call come through. His partner, Rodriguez, exchanged a knowing glance. They'd gotten calls like this before. Vague descriptions, coded language, masking bias. Daniels sighed, gripping the wheel tighter. "Another false alarm rooted in prejudice," he muttered. Still, duty called and they drove toward the address. When the squad car pulled up, Trevor spotted it immediately. For a moment, doubt crept in. Should he stay seated? Go inside? Then he straightened, reminding himself he'd done nothing wrong. If anything, this was an opportunity to challenge assumptions, to assert his humanity. As the officers approached, Trevor stepped forward. "Hey," he said with a wry smile. "I think you're here for me." Daniels froze, recognition dawning. "Wait, Trevor Noah?" "Yes, that's me," Trevor replied, his tone light but firm. "Unless I've committed a crime by reading a book, I assume we can clear this up quickly." Daniels hesitated. "We got a call about someone looking suspicious. Just following up." "Suspicious?" Trevor raised an eyebrow. "Interesting choice of words. Tell me, officer, how often do these calls turn out legit?" "Not many," Daniels admitted reluctantly. Behind them, Karen emerged, pale and shaky. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay," she stammered. Trevor turned to her, his gaze steady but kind. "Karen, right? Why did you think I needed reporting? Was it my book, my headphones, or was it something else entirely?" Her mouth opened and closed. I don't know," she whispered, tears forming. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "You weren't," Trevor said softly. "But maybe now you'll understand why this matters. Maybe now you'll see the harm in jumping to conclusions based on skin color." As the conversation unfolded, Daniels stepped closer, drawn in by Trevor's words. "It's not just individuals," Trevor continued. "It's a system that allows these kinds of calls without question, and it's a system we all have a responsibility to change." By the time the encounter ended, something shifted. Not just for Karen, but for Daniels and the growing crowd of curious neighbors who had gathered unnoticed. Trevor returned to his porch, surrounded by murmurs of reflection and resolve. Progress wouldn't come overnight, but seeds had been planted, and hope bloomed quietly in the hearts of those willing to listen. The sound of the police car pulling up sent a familiar knot twisting in Trevor's stomach. It was a feeling he knew all too well, the kind that came from years of being watched, questioned, and judged for simply existing as a black man. He sat still on his porch, gripping the edges of his book tightly, memories flooding back like waves crashing against the shore. He remembered being 10 years old, standing in front of a store with his hands full of snacks he'd paid for, only to have the clerk accuse him of stealing. His mother had been furious but powerless, her voice trembling as she demanded respect while tears stung her eyes. Then there was high school, when a teacher called him articulate, as if it were surprising, or the time a security guard followed him around a mall just because he happened to glance at an expensive watch. Each memory reinforced what he already knew. The world often saw him not as a person, but as a threat. Across the street, Karen stood by her window, watching the squad car approach. Her heart raced, though not out of fear for her safety. She felt certain she'd done the right thing. In her mind, calling the police wasn't about targeting Trevor specifically. It was about protecting her family, her neighborhood, everything she held dear. She told herself she wasn't racist. She had nothing against black people, except when they didn't belong where they were. And Trevor, sitting casually on his porch with headphones on, didn't fit her image of who should live here. She thought about how clean her block was, how orderly everything seemed, until moments like this disrupted the peace. To her, Trevor's presence was a crack in the foundation of her perfect little world. She clutched her coffee mug tighter, convincing herself she was justified. After all, wasn't it better to be safe than sorry? Officer Daniels stepped out of the patrol car, exchanging uneasy glances with his partner. They both knew calls like this were rarely legitimate. More often than not, they stemmed from bias, a neighbor seeing someone unfamiliar and assuming the worst. Still, protocol demanded they investigate. Daniels sighed, adjusting his hat as he approached Trevor's house. He hated these situations. Every false report chipped away at trust, not just between communities and law enforcement, but within himself. Was he doing his job, or perpetuating a system built on inequality? Karen hurried outside, her face flushed with urgency. "Officers," she called out, waving them over. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I'm telling you, something feels off about him. He's just sitting there, listening to music, looking sketchy." "Sketchy?" Daniels repeated, raising an eyebrow. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. "Yes," Karen insisted, her voice rising. "He doesn't look like he belongs here. Doesn't that matter?" Before Daniels could respond, Trevor appeared at the edge of his porch. He walked toward them calmly, his expression composed but tinged with amusement. "Hey," he said, flashing a wry smile. "I think you're here for me." Daniels froze, recognition dawning on his face. "Wait, Trevor Noah?" "That's right," Trevor replied, his tone light but firm. "And unless I've committed some crime by enjoying a good book, I assume we can clear this up quickly." Her cheeks burned red as embarrassment washed over her. This wasn't supposed to happen. Famous people weren't supposed to be the ones getting reported. She stammered, trying to explain herself. I didn't know it was you. I thought... You thought I didn't belong." Trevor finished for her, his smile fading into something more serious. "Let's talk about why you thought that. Was it my book, my headphones, or was it because I'm black?" Her silence spoke volumes. Tears welled up in her eyes as guilt and shame overwhelmed her. For the first time, she began to see the harm in her actions. Not just today, but every other time she'd let prejudice guide her decisions. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "We get calls like this a lot," he admitted. "Most of them turn out to be baseless. But it makes you wonder, why do we keep getting them? What does that say about us as a society?" Trevor nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "It says we've got work to do. Calls like this aren't just about individuals. They're symptoms of a bigger problem, a system that lets fear and bias dictate who gets treated like a human being and who doesn't." As the conversation unfolded, tension filled the air. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, curious about the commotion. Some felt defensive, others sympathetic, but everyone sensed that something significant was happening. Trevor's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the absurdity of the situation, highlighting his resilience and strength. By the time the officers prepared to leave, Karen was visibly shaken. Trevor's words lingered in her mind, forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself and the world she lived in. Meanwhile, Daniels promised himself he'd push harder for change within his department, knowing that true justice required more than following orders. It demanded accountability. But the story wasn't over yet. As Trevor returned to his porch, the weight of the moment settled around him. He knew this confrontation was just one step in a much larger journey. The real question was, what would happen next? For Karen, for the neighborhood, and for the countless others facing similar struggles every day. Trevor stepped forward, his movements deliberate but unhurried. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he refused to let it show. Instead, he met Karen's gaze with a calmness that seemed almost unnerving in its steadiness. "Karen," he began, his voice soft yet firm, "why did you find me suspicious? Was it because I was sitting on my porch? Or was it something else?" Karen shifted uncomfortably, her defenses already crumbling under the simplicity of his question. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. Trevor didn't push. He simply waited, giving her space to confront the thoughts she'd been too afraid to articulate even to herself. I don't know," Karen finally stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. Her hands trembled as she wrung them together. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting my family." The words tumbled out in a rush, each one laced with guilt and confusion. "But now I'm not so sure." Her vulnerability hung heavy in the air, raw and unfiltered. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly consider why she had called the police. Not just today, but every other time fear had overridden reason. It wasn't about safety, not really. It was about control, about keeping things predictable and familiar, and somewhere deep inside, she knew how wrong that was. Trevor nodded slowly, his expression softening. "It's okay to admit when we're wrong," he said gently. "What matters is what we do next. But before we talk about that, I want you to hear something." He paused, taking a deep breath. "When I was 10 years old, a store clerk accused me of stealing candy I'd already paid for. My mom cried that day, not because she was angry, but because she felt powerless. That moment stayed with me, Karen. It taught me that people see me differently, no matter how hard I try to prove otherwise." His voice grew stronger as he continued, recounting stories of discrimination that had shaped his life. "In high school, teachers praised me for being articulate, as if they expected less from me. In college, security guards followed me through stores without cause. And just last year, someone called the cops on me while I was jogging in broad daylight. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a pattern, a system that tells people like you that it's okay to doubt us, to fear us, simply because of the color of our skin." Karen listened intently, her face pale and stricken. Each story hit her like a punch to the gut, forcing her to see the world through Trevor's eyes. She realized now how much harm her actions had caused, not just to him, but to countless others who lived with the same daily indignities. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, "I never meant to hurt anyone." Officer Daniels stepped closer, his own emotions simmering beneath the surface. "We get calls like this all the time," he admitted, his tone heavy with regret. "Most of them are baseless, rooted in bias rather than fact, but every single one chips away at trust, between communities, between officers and civilians, and even within ourselves. I've spent years enforcing laws without questioning whether those laws serve everyone equally. Today, I'm starting to see that they don't." The honesty in his words created a ripple effect, breaking down walls that had stood for far too long. Karen wiped her tears, nodding slowly. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted. But I want to try. Trevor smiled faintly, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Change starts with accountability, he said, his voice rising slightly as he addressed not just Karen and Daniels, but the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered unnoticed. It starts with admitting we're part of a flawed system and committing to do better. We can't undo the past, but we can shape the future. Empathy isn't enough. We need action, real, meaningful action. His words resonated deeply, echoing in the hearts of those who heard them. Neighbors exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others visibly uncomfortable as they grappled with their own complicity. One woman clutched her child's hand tighter, whispering something into his ear. Another man scribbled notes on his phone, perhaps planning to research systemic racism later. Even Officer Daniels straightened his posture, determination etched across his face. As the conversation drew to a close, Trevor returned to his porch, the tension easing but not entirely gone. Karen lingered for a moment longer, her mind racing with newfound resolve. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. Silence was no longer an option. The neighborhood buzzed with quiet reflection, the seeds of transformation planted in fertile soil. Though progress wouldn't come overnight, hope bloomed nonetheless. A fragile but resilient promise that change was possible. Karen stood there, her hands trembling as she looked at Trevor. Tears streamed down her face, and for the first time she truly understood the weight of what she had done. "Trevor," she began, her voice shaky but sincere, "I am so sorry. I never meant to hurt you or anyone else. I was wrong. So wrong. I didn't realize how much harm I caused." Trevor listened quietly, his expression calm but measured. He could see the remorse in her eyes, but he also knew that apologies alone couldn't undo the damage. "Thank you for saying that, Karen," he replied gently. "But words aren't enough. If you really want to make things right, it's going to take more than just an apology. It's going to take action." Karen nodded earnestly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Tell me what I can do," she said, her voice filled with determination. "I don't want to be part of the problem anymore. I want to help fix it." Trevor smiled faintly, appreciating her willingness to change. "Start by educating yourself," he advised. "Read books, listen to stories from people who've lived through discrimination. Understand why these issues exist and how deep they run. And then use your voice. Speak up when you see injustice, even if it makes you uncomfortable. That's where real change begins." Over the following weeks, Karen threw herself into learning. She attended workshops on racial equity, joined online forums discussing systemic racism, and hosted small gatherings in her home to share what she'd learned with neighbors. At first, some were hesitant to engage, but Karen's honesty about her own mistakes opened doors. Slowly, others began to join her efforts, inspired by her vulnerability and determination. The ripple effects spread throughout the neighborhood. One resident organized a community potluck celebrating diverse cultures, while another started a book club focused on anti-racism literature. Conversations that had once been avoided became commonplace, and walls that had divided neighbors began to crumble. The air felt lighter, freer, as though a long-held tension was finally easing. Trevor noticed the changes too. As he sat on his porch one evening, he watched children of all backgrounds playing together on the sidewalk, their laughter echoing through the streets. Neighbors chatted warmly, exchanging stories and smiles without hesitation. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, reminders of old biases. But progress was undeniable. He leaned back in his chair, reflecting on everything that had happened. The confrontation with Karen, the conversations with Officer Daniels, the quiet transformations among his neighbors. It all added up to something meaningful. Progress wasn't linear, and it certainly wasn't fast, but every step mattered. Every effort counted. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, Trevor thought about the road ahead. Overcoming racism wasn't something one person could achieve alone. It required everyone working together. True justice isn't just about calling out prejudice, he murmured to himself. It's about building empathy, fostering understanding, and holding each other accountable. We all have a role to play. His thoughts turned to the future. A brighter, fairer world within reach if enough people committed to change. Empathy alone wouldn't dismantle systemic barriers, but combined with education and solidarity, it could spark transformation. Trevor felt a renewed sense of hope, knowing that even small actions could lead to big differences. The night grew quieter, the sounds of the neighborhood fading into a peaceful hum. Trevor rose from his chair, feeling grateful for the steps taken and optimistic about those yet to come. Change was hard, messy, and often slow, but it was possible, and as long as people kept pushing forward, there was always reason to believe in a better tomorrow.